Hey, welcome back. All right, today we'll finish World War One. So I'm going to start on slide 269. America gets involved in the war. This is America's first truly overseas intervention on such a large scale. Woodrow Wilson is president of the United States, and he's going to play a major role in the peace conference. So you'll see a lot of Woodrow Wilson later. Now, Woodrow Wilson was not ready to get into World War One. He was actually born in the 1850s. I forget what year. I think 1856. But he was a little boy when William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia. I believe Wilson was from Georgia. So Wilson sees the devastation in the American South, and that was kind of a total war in the American South during the Civil War. He realizes how terrible war can be. So when the Lusitania sinks, when the Germans are sinking American ships, he does not want to get involved. Teddy Roosevelt said that Woodrow Wilson was a prime jackass, and I'll skin him alive if he doesn't go to war. So Teddy Roosevelt was like, let's go to war. We got to defeat the Germans. Henry Cabot Lodge, who's the Republican leader in the Senate, he said, Wilson is afraid. He flinches in the presence of danger, physical and moral. But here's what Wilson said. I come from the South and I know what war is, for I have seen its terrible wreckage and ruin. It is easy for me as president to declare war. I do not have to fight, and neither do the gentlemen on the hill who now clamor for it. It is some poor farmer's boy or the son of some poor widow who will have to do the fighting and dying. Despite his best efforts, America gets dragged into the war. Germany basically decides, well, there's two things. Germany ends its unrestricted submarine warfare, so they actually start sinking ships again, and the Germans asked the Mexicans to attack America, and they said, we'll get you land back that you lost in the Mexican-American War. So these two things, submarine warfare and the Zimmerman Note, that was the secret telegram from Germany trying to get Mexico to enter the war to attack the United States. That brings America into war. If you look at slide 274, a German admiral basically did some calculations, and he said, I know you're worried that America will get in the war and defeat us, tip the scales, but just hear me out. America would take a long time to mobilize, to train an army, and then to send it all the way to Europe. If you start sinking every British ship you can, every American ship you can, if you just start sinking everything and totally cut off Great Britain will actually starve before the Americans can get here. So if you do this, you'll have the opportunity to defeat the British and the French before the Americans get over here. So basically, Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, kind of the military heads of Germany, they say, that sounds like a good idea. Let's just go for it. We'll risk it. We'll risk America getting in the war because we think we can win it before they actually come over to fight. Eventually, though, that admiral didn't do his calculations right, or the British figure things out. Basically, the convoy system, ships start traveling in groups. They figure out how to fight submarines. So the Germans are never able to sink enough to get the British out of the war. When Wilson declares war, he says a couple important things. Slide 280. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. The world must be made safe for democracy. You have to remember that. That's what this is all about. And if you think about it, this is April 1917. This is after the Democratic Revolution in Russia, but it's before the Communist Revolution. So Great Britain is a democracy, France is a democracy, and now Russia is a democracy. So if the United States joins their side, it will be the democracies versus the autocracies. The United States joins as an associate power. They don't call themselves allies. Wilson doesn't like a lot of things Britain and France do, things such as colonization, colonialism. He doesn't like that. So Woodrow Wilson basically says the good guys are Britain and France, but they also have a lot of things they do that are bad too, so I don't want to quite be tainted with them. Wilson's very idealistic. General John Pershing is the American leader, the American head general. He's sent to Europe in 1917 before the majority of American troops get there, and he's going to help lead Americans into battle. The Americans are called doughboys. There's different origins about this name. You can kind of read about them. There's a lot of really famous men who aren't famous yet, but in World War II, they're going to be really important. Harry Truman is in World War I. George Patton is in World War I. Douglas MacArthur is in World War I. George Marshall is in World War I. So you can we'll learn more about those guys later. Okay, look at slide 290. The 14 points are basically Wilson's idealistic dreams for the war. He basically tells this is what America is fighting for. National determination, self-determination for other countries. So if you're an ethnic group and you don't have a country, you should be able to have your own country. Open covenants. Remember how all those alliances at the beginning of the war plunged the nation into war? He doesn't want any more of those. Disarmament, freedom of the seas, free trade, return of occupied lands. The most important thing Wilson wants, though, is an international League of Nations to settle disputes between countries. We need a place we can all go talk to so we don't just go to war when we have an issue with each other. If you look at slide 291, that's his actual 14 points. Okay, the end of the war. Basically, the Germans realize the Americans are coming. We've got to win the war before they get here. That's what Erich Ludendorff says. So the Germans decide on this very, very last-ditch effort. It's called the Michael Offensive. Basically, soldiers from the Eastern Front leave and they come join the Western Front. And the Germans are going to use their superior numbers to attack. If you look at slide 297, that shaded in area is where the offensive occurs, and they almost punch through. It begins in March 1918. The Germans have amazing success at first. They knock the British and the French back about 40 miles. The first day of the attack, 7,000 British soldiers are killed, 20,000 POWs. It's just awful. The Allies have a huge meeting, decide they have to fight. What ends up happening is they end up stopping the Germans. It was going so well that the Kaiser even gave the school children of Germany a day off from school for a victory day. But basically, the British and the French counterattack and they stop the Germans. When the Germans get close to Paris, they launch an attack on Paris with this huge artillery gun called the Paris gun. You can see it on 308. I've even got a YouTube clip talking about it. Basically, you have the Second Battle of the Marne. Germany fails to capture Paris. And at this point, Germany realizes the war is over. One by one, Germany's allies start to fall out. Bulgaria surrenders. The Ottoman Empire surrenders. Austria-Hungary surrenders. September 1918, Ludendorff tells the Kaiser, you have to surrender. The Germans surrendered more easily because they knew of Wilson's 14 points. And a lot of the Germans thought, hey, Woodrow Wilson is going to treat us fairly at the peace conference, so we can surrender to him because he'll be nice to us. We can't surrender necessarily to the British or the French. They just want vengeance. But because Wilson's involved, he'll be fair-minded later on. Ludendorff resigns. On November 8th, the German armistice delegation meets General Foch. The armistice is set to take place November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. So that's when the fighting has to stop. And this is kind of sad, but at 5 or 6 a.m. they sign the armistice, and then it takes like 5 or 6 hours to get into effect. In those 5 or 6 hours, something like 10,000 men are killed. So the war is basically over, but they still have 10,000 deaths. Look at slide 323. Here's the armistice terms. And you have to remember, an armistice is not a peace treaty. It's not a surrender. Armistice just means you agree to stop fighting. So that's all the things Germany has to do in order to have the fighting stop, and they do sign it. Look at slide 325. Germany, the country of Germany, doesn't actually get invaded. When the armistice is signed, Germany is actually in Belgian territory. So if you're a German citizen back home, the only thing you know is that your country is blockaded, so people are starving, but you don't have any cities that are lying in ruins. Your roads aren't ripped up, your crops aren't destroyed. You still have your country intact. So a lot of Germans are shocked when Germany decides to kind of surrender. German citizens are like, "What? Our armies are in Belgium. We thought we were winning." So it's a big shock. The Kaiser abdicates and I believe he goes to Holland. So a lot of Germans don't really think they lost the war. That's going to be important for people like Hitler later on. So the war is finally over. On slide 328, I've got a YouTube clip. If there's only one YouTube clip you watch from this, you should watch that one. It shows you what it's like when the war is over. It shows you the men celebrating. It shows you the devastation. You should definitely watch that. Like I said, everyone's happy. Germany, they're happy because they don't have to fight anymore. This terrible war's over. There's shock. They don't understand why they lost the war. Germany becomes democratic, so there's lots of change. A lot of Germans, like Hitler, feel stabbed in the back by the politicians. He always references the November criminals. These are the Germans who decided to stop fighting, signed the surrender. And Hitler's not the only one that feels this way. A lot of Germans do. You can look at slide 331 and see the amount of loss. 20 million men are wounded, 7 million permanently. A 1920 estimate put the cost of the war at $337 billion. The peace conference happens in 1919. It's January to June 1919. There's 5 countries. They're called the Big Five. Great Britain, France, U.S., Italy, and Japan. Eventually, Italy and Japan go home. So basically, the most important people at the peace conference are George Clemenceau of France, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, and David Lloyd George of Britain. Now, the victorious Allies sign a peace conference with every country, but separately. So the Treaty of Versailles is the one signed with Germany. That's the most important one. So that's the one I'm kind of going to talk about. Remember, Wilson promised a just peace. He wants self-determination. He wants a League of Nations. Europeans are just thinking, how can we redraw the map? How can we take Germany down a notch? We need to prevent a future war. So a lot of the Europeans are thinking like Congress of Vienna, how do we fix this situation? How do we keep Germany down so they'll never rise again and threaten the peace of Europe? Time is very important. The armies are going home. What if Germany says, sorry, we're not going to follow the peace treaty? If you don't have an army to enforce it, Germany just will say, sorry, we don't follow the peace treaty. So you have to get this thing done before the armies go home. Wilson, people ask him to go see hospitals, go see battle sites. He refuses because he doesn't want emotion to make decisions. He wants his clear thinking head to make decisions. This is my favorite quote of all on 344. God gave us the 10 commandments and we broke them. Wilson gives us 14 points. We shall see. George Clemenceau does not like Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is a college professor. He was before he became president. He's a very idealistic guy. He loves to put ideas down on paper. A lot of Europeans are like, Wilson, on paper, you can think whatever you want, but in the real world, that stuff won't work. So you'll kind of see what happens. Germany is forced to sign the Versailles Treaty. It's got over 440 articles. It's a huge document. But look at slide 345. These are some of the things that happened. Germany loses all of her colonies and 13% of her land in Europe. She loses 10% of her population. Alsace and Lorraine go back. Lands go to Belgium and Denmark. Eastern lands go to Poland. Germany is limited to an army of 100,000 men. They're not allowed to have an air force, submarines, or gas weapons. The Rhineland, which is German land, is demilitarized. The Allies are supposed to occupy it for 15 years. The Germans are never allowed to have a union with Austria, so they can never become one country. Germany has to pay about 32 billion in reparations. Germany has to sign the war guilt clause. This is Article 231 that says we, Germany, are responsible for this war. You know, World War I, World War II is easy to think about. You know, it's good versus evil. It's Hitler versus the democracies. You know, World War I's not quite so clear. You know, Germany wasn't evil. Britain wasn't evil. France wasn't evil. They were just stupid in a lot of ways. But Germany has to assume that they are responsible for everything. The Germans don't like this. The whole country is outraged by this. The Germans have to give their navy to the British, so the Germans actually sink a lot of their navy before the British can get it. So if you look at slide 353, you can see the land that Germany had to give up. So look at that. Okay, real quick. At this point, a lot of the history we'll talk about will involve some American history just because America starts playing a big role in the 20th century. The Treaty of Versailles includes the League of Nations. So this is an international community that's supposed to prevent future wars. The peace treaty comes back to America, and the United States Senate has to ratify the treaty. Wilson is a Democrat, and the Senate is controlled by the Republicans. Henry Cabot Lodge is the Republican Senate Majority Leader. A lot of people in America don't like the League of Nations, and they don't dislike it just because they hate cooperating with the international community. There's actually this article in the League of Nations called Article 10, and it says if there's ever a future conflict, America might have to go be the policeman of Europe. A lot of Americans are thinking like, you got to be kidding me. Europe just fought the bloodiest war in history, and we might have to go to Europe in 10 or 20 years and help them keep the peace. If this amount of death and destruction doesn't convince them that war is bad, nothing will. We don't want anything with being the policeman of Europe. So there's a lot of Republicans that tell Wilson, we will join the League of Nations, but you got to get rid of Article 10. We don't want to be forced to send our troops to Europe to be the policeman of Europe. Wilson says, nope, you take the League as it is or not at all. So they end up, Wilson goes on thousands and thousands of miles to speak to the United States. He tries to get the nation to write letters to their senators, urging them to sign the Treaty of Versailles as it is. There's a great quote on 360. I do not hesitate to say that the war we have just been through, though it was shot through with terror of every kind, is not to be compared with the war we would have to face next time. What the Germans used were toys as compared with what they would use in the next war. Wilson ends up having he collapses later on. He has a stroke, so he can't campaign anymore. And the League of Nations is defeated. The Republican-controlled Senate defeats the League of Nations. So the League of Nations does exist. You know, Britain, France, other countries in Europe are included. But the League of Nations is missing Germany because they're not allowed to join right away. There's no Russia in the League of Nations because Russia has gone communist, and there's no America. So three of the biggest players in World War I are not in the League of Nations. So we'll kind of see from this point on how the League of Nations is not very successful in preventing World War II. Okay, so that's World War I. There's so much on this war. I tried to condense it all down. I actually teach a class for Barton just on the war. So part of me is having a hard time because there's so much more I want to talk about, but I had to try to hit the high points. I will post some documentaries. If you do want to learn, I gave you those books, but I'll also give you some things you can watch. and you can just learn on your own for later on if you'd like to. So, all right, we're done with World War I.